and welcome to episode 149 of Prose. This week, grapple with a bumpy relationship that might bring down a presidential administration. We have a real treat today. Our program features an adaptation from guest author S.A. Mackenzie's upcoming novel, What We Cannot Hear. Let's get excited for our first guest author of 2022. While you listen, please consider heading to prosepodcast.com, our one-stop shop for all things prose. There you can find links to social media, the episodes, a shop for swag, the show's Patreon, and more. On social media, like and share away. Most importantly, please do consider subscribing, rating, and or reviewing wherever you grab your podcasts and music. Thanks for listening. Let's get to the tales, shall we? This week, we have S.A. Mackenzie's Heavy as the Head and Silence Like Cancer Grows from What We Cannot Hear. Enjoy. From the collection What We Cannot Hear by S.A. Mackenzie. Heavy is the Head. Joseph Ellis sat in his White House office as snow fell outside his window. The flakes gathered and settled on the panes of glass and the bushes outside, blanketing everything around them with heavy dampness, muffling the sounds of the city. The cold seeped through the windows and into his bones, and he considered what he needed to do today. Taking a moment to breathe, his fingers trembled slightly as he flipped absently through a file, hardly paying any attention to it. CNN played quietly in the background on the TV in front of him, and the one on the right played C-SPAN. He had minutes to spare before the staff meeting that afternoon, and everything going on made concentrating difficult. Words from a previous conversation rattled around in his mind, and he was so tired of hearing their echo, over and over and over again. He had to make a decision. Whether he wanted to do it or not, that was another story. He and the president conversed often on the subject, especially after Joseph's daughter came in and confronted him about his relationship with the newly hired senior consultant, Dr. Spencer Thompson. He was grateful the president was the only one there for that conversation. He expected his secretary would say something and gossip about what she'd heard, but, surprisingly, she hadn't said a word. His relationship with Spencer remained a secret, but it was time to let everyone else in on it. In hindsight, the relationship was probably a bad idea. He could already picture his communications director up on his moral high horse, talking down to him about how this was reckless and irresponsible, but Joseph couldn't care less. What he did care about was Spencer's reaction to it. He'd even gone as far as planning the upcoming meeting so she couldn't attend. Again, in hindsight, this was a bad idea. But it was time. He glanced at the clock and took a breath. He had about 10 minutes before his staff began trickling in. Then he had to tell his side of the story. His stomach churned dangerously, the fear percolating there. He tried concentrating on the file he was reading, but the words kept slipping around on the page, and he finally just set it down, leaning back in his chair. A knock on the door pulled him back to the present and away from intrusive thoughts about Spencer. What all this was making him feel and how scared he was. But, before he could answer it, The heavy oak door swung open to reveal a shock of curly black hair pulled up in a bright, multicolored headscarf, tied off by a bow in front, followed immediately by the radiant, smiling face of Spencer Thompson. Joseph's breath caught in his throat, and, for a moment, he felt like he couldn't breathe. She was so beautiful. All he wanted to do was sweep her up in his arms and tell her the truth, tell her what he was planning. But he couldn't. The words stuck there with the breath, and he felt his heartbeat quicken. Spencer stepped inside the office, awash with warm light from the lamps scattered around it. Her dark eyes shone amber, the light making her deep blue pantsuit shimmer as she moved. Every action was infused with power and exuded calm. Despite his pounding heart, he felt more relaxed in her presence, even though his thoughts raged like a storm. Each time she appeared in his office, he was struck by how silently she moved, and how he wondered if that was a side effect of her deafness, or if she was just soft-footed. Whatever the case, her heavily accented voice and the sound of the door shutting pulled him from his reverie, reminding him how to breathe again. "I heard we were having a staff meeting." He immediately made sure she could see his lips clearly as he replied, "We do. You and Ronnie don't." Spencer's brown eyes narrowed. "We're part of the senior staff." "I need you and Ronnie to go talk to White House counsel." Her eyes narrowed further. "Why?" she signed instead of speaking. "Rumblings" is all he signed back. His sign language was rudimentary at best, but he was trying to learn it for her. Anything for her. "Because you hired me and Ronnie." It wasn't a question. Joseph nodded in reply. "Of course." Spencer approached his desk and rounded it. She settled beside him and took his hand, brushing a dark thumb over the gold band on his ring finger. His gaze flicked down to it as she continued. "They're displeased you've done so." "That's not to say I regret it. I don't. It was a great idea to hire the both of you." "But..." Spencer trailed off, squeezing his hand gently. Under any other circumstance, he would have squeezed her hand back, gently reminding her they were at work and needed to be careful. But at that moment, Joseph didn't care. He felt tossed around like a rowboat in the middle of the sea, and her touch soothed him. "But Senate Republicans aren't happy." He tugged her closer. "You know nothing can keep them happy right now. We bend over backward to appease them, and they fire back with thinly veiled threats and vitriol." A sigh, and he turned so he could briefly rest his head against her side. "Do you think anything will come of it?" Joseph lifted his head so she could see him. "Not at all. You will both be fine." "This is just a precaution?" she asked hopefully. "Yes, of course." Spencer seemed comforted by those words, but Joseph spotted a spark of uncertainty shimmering in those amber eyes. He felt bad for lying to her, but the words slipped so easily from his tongue, and it was too hard to pull them back, to retract them. Even if he tried, it would be a dangerous thing. What could be more dangerous than giving an eternal optimist a false sense of security in the ever-shifting storm of politics? He was sure he would find out, but hopefully not right now. That would be reserved for later when he told her the truth. God help him. Another knock signaled it was time to get ready for the meeting. He sighed heavily, bringing her hand up to kiss the back of it gently before letting go. "You'll let me know how it goes?" "I will. Chinese tonight?" He nodded once. "Takeout? You'll get it on the way?" "Of course." He paused as she moved from his desk. As she reached the door, she turned to check if he had anything to add, as was her custom, and continued. "Tell Ronnie to let you out early." She snorted. "I'll try." She opened the door, and senior staff began to trickle in as she left. When they and their assistants were all settled in his office, Joseph looked at all of them. He considered backing out of the whole thing, but decided not to. Now was the time. There was no going back. In her Columbia Heights apartment, Spencer paced. Back and forth, wearing a flat spot in her rug. All the curtains were tightly drawn. Only a single lamp and the unnatural blue glow of her television screen illuminated the inky darkness of the winter evening. She received the text about 5 minutes into their staff meeting. Nate, worried about her and worried about what Joseph revealed, messaged her. All it said was, "He told us all." Joseph told them, and now people were camped out in front of her apartment. Hell, she was watching the president's press secretary field questions about their relationship and what this meant for the administration. The bitter taste of bile rose in the back of her throat. How dare he? She had just finished speaking with the White House counsel about the problems arising from her being hired into the administration. Now she looked like an idiot in front of everyone. A lovesick idiot unable to keep herself in check when faced with the second most powerful man in the world. A lovesick idiot now threatening the image of the entire administration in the realm of public opinion. Great. Just great. The lights above her oven flashed, signaling someone was at the door. She knew who that someone had to be, and the fact he was there, probably having passed through a throng of reporters, it made her angrier. Despite that, she swung the door open to stand face to face with Joseph Ellis. He looked exhausted, but he was there, with the Chinese as promised. She tilted her head and stepped aside to let him in. Once he passed, she shut the door behind him. "You lied to me." He paused on the way to the kitchen. Turning slowly, his entire body seemed to slump. His face was drawn, the frown lines and wrinkles at the corners of his eyes looking even deeper than they already were. One hand carted through his silver and white hair, and she tracked the sigh that worked through his body. "I didn't lie to you, Penny." "Of course you did. You lied, and I'm going to be fired. God only knows what'll happen to the president." "Tien's going to be fine." "But Ronnie and I won't be." "You will be fine, too." "Don't say that," she signed viciously. "Don't keep lying to me." The anger rose hot in her cheeks, painting them red. She felt the heat radiating off them. Desperation rose in his dark brown eyes, but it did nothing to soothe the tempest swirling within her chest, or the sickness settling at the base of her stomach. "I trusted you, Joseph. You betrayed that trust," she sighed. "Penny." He trailed off and set the Chinese food on the counter. Turning, he faced her, ensuring she could read his lips. She wasn't even sure she wanted to. "No, don't you penny me. Don't you dare. You told them and didn't allow me to even be there. That was on purpose. You knew how I would react, and now the press knows. The press, Joseph," she hissed. His shoulders slumped. "I don't know who told them. Besides, it doesn't matter who." "Yes, it does matter. You did this, Joseph. You have to fix it." "Fix it?" His voice was rising. The way his lips got harder to read in his frustration, a clear indication of that fact. "Fix it? I can't fix this, Spencer. The only way to fix it is to fire you or if you resign." "I won't resign. You know how much—" "I do know. And so does the president. He won't let anything happen to you, Spencer. If you turn in your resignation, you know he won't accept it.
Then you'll have no choice but to fire me. Joseph was quiet. The rage fueling Spencer's body, the tension that had built and built, evaporated, and she deflated. Her shoulders slumped, and she pinched the bridge of her nose. A headache pounded at the base of her skull. Everything she sacrificed, everything she accomplished until that point was now at the mercy of the court of public opinion. Her job wasn't safe, and she felt like a pariah. She could puke. I'll turn in my badge and clean out my office tomorrow. There was nothing she could do. Tears welled to the surface, and she viciously turned on him. I trusted you. He crossed the room to touch her shoulder, standing in front of her, ensuring his lips were still easy to read. I know. I'm sorry. She jerked away from him. Don't say you're sorry when you don't mean it. Switching off the television, she plunged the room into oranges and ambers. Spencer fiddled with her phone as her mind considered all the little things she could do now. The things that would change, like where she'd have to go to return to work. She'd have to move and bring Ronnie with her. That depended on whether he even wanted to continue working with her. She could curse. In fact, she was, silently, her entire body keying up again and starting to shake. Reaching over to the side table for her phone, she was intent on texting her interpreter. Then she caught Joseph's reflection in the screen. What are you still doing here? Spencer asked, turning to face him again. He was on his phone and held up a finger as he turned his back on her. For a moment, the anger blazed again, only to vanish when Joseph turned back around. The color drained from his face. Joseph? What happened? House Republicans are drawing up articles of impeachment against the president. Her stomach dropped. Because of me? He didn't need to answer. She already knew. What we cannot hear. Silence like cancer grows. Following the announcement that President Ken Wagner was being investigated for impeachment proceedings, Spencer Thompson buried herself in work. If she could just focus on this bill for refunding the NEA, she could forget what she was being asked to do. Forget she was effectively being asked to throw President Wagner under the bus. Forget they would ask questions about Joseph, about her job, her past, Jack. The thought of dragging Jack, and by extension Joseph, even though she was still pissed at him, through the muck of these proceedings almost made her throw up right there at her desk. But she swallowed thickly against the knee-jerk reaction and kept working. It was the only thing she could do without devolving into anger, frustration, and tears. Not that that was completely off the table. She'd been struggling against that for weeks, attempting to gather herself and work with her lawyer once it was clear her deposition wasn't going away. However, that day, sitting at her desk, she couldn't hold it back any longer. She just cried. She didn't know what else to do. In hindsight, crying in the office was always a bad idea. There were eyes everywhere, and after Joseph revealed their relationship to the staff, there were reporters everywhere as well. She couldn't hide. There was always someone who might see her, and whether they were the person who leaked the story in the first place or not, she was now suspicious of everyone she interacted with. She never figured out who that was, but she had a few ideas. Spencer lifted her head to take a deep breath, attempting to gather herself when she saw the president about to wave for her attention. She stood immediately, almost knocking her chair backward and into the window. She hastily wiped at her eyes, ashamed, but the president appeared at least a little sympathetic. That was the great thing about President Wagner. He was kind and looked after his staffers. He never felt the need to belittle them, berate them, or demand they take control of their emotions. "Emotions make you stronger," he told her plenty of times after she got heated over something in meetings with congressmen and other officials. She knew that, but sometimes she needed the reminder. "Mr. President," she began, reaching for a tissue to dab at her eyes, her ruined mascara blackening it. "How long were you standing there?" President Wagner smiled reassuringly, his hands shoved in his trouser pockets, green eyes sparkling rather fondly in the dim light of the office. "Not long," he replied, reaching out to shut the door before waving her to sit. "You okay?" She waved him off. "I'm fine." "To what do I owe the pleasure, sir?" "I just came to check on you, Spencer. I know things have been difficult for you recently." Her shoulders slumped and tears welled in her brown eyes. She tried to blink them away. They would make it harder for her to read his lips. "I'm, as they say, battling. That's all I can do right now." He nodded. She could see the gears in his head turning, but she kept her mouth shut and waited for him to speak. "Is there anything I can do to make things easier?" Spencer quirked an eyebrow in surprise. "With all due respect, Mr. President, I appreciate the offer, but you have bigger things to worry about right now." A smile spread across his face and his shoulders shook with laughter. She felt shades of confusion mingling with the surprise and sadness she bore. She didn't know quite what to do with that. Why was he laughing? "Oh, I'm not worried about that impeachment at all." A feeling of horror and all-encompassing anxiety gripped her heart. "Mr. President, with all due respect, you should be. We all should be." "Why?" She was just about to speak when he continued. "Because I hired you. I hired Ronnie. I went through the proper channels and followed the law. But Republican senators still object. Because you were a therapist before this? He sneered at the thought. "They'll uncover more," Spencer pointed out dutifully. "Let them, Spencer. We're ready for them." She laughed weakly. "I'm not." She took a breath to calm her raging nerves and the surprise at his nonchalance. "Mr. President, I wish you would reconsider my resignation. Mine and Ronnie." "You and Ronnie are indispensable members of my staff. I do not and will not accept your resignations." He was stubborn. She had to give him that. Absently, she scratched the back of her neck during the ensuing lull in the conversation, her mind wandering. It quickly refocused on the present when she saw the president speaking, and she managed to catch the tail end of the words. "I'm sorry, can you repeat that, Mr. President?" "When's your deposition?" "Tomorrow." He nodded, once again mulling over something. "Has Joseph talked to you at all?" "Not yet." I noticed you two aren't really speaking much. Is everything all right?" "Define all right," she said wryly. "Do you want me to talk to him about it?" President Wagner asked. "Not particularly, sir, but thank you." The president nodded, suddenly appearing worried about something. She watched as he stared a hole in an inconspicuous spot of her desk. "Was there something else, sir?" He glanced at her. "Has he told you about anything in particular? About himself? About his past?" The president was fishing, skirting around something she couldn't grasp. But what was it? And why did it have the president of all people worried? He obviously wasn't bothered about the impeachment hearings, but whatever this was had him ruffled. I know he's a recovering alcoholic. That's all he's told me. He looked nervous. Every time he worried around her, he'd take off his glasses and fiddle with them, like he was deep in thought or something. He did that now, as soon as she finished talking, eyes darting from her face to the floor to the desk and back to her. Her anxiety peaked, butterflies flapping around in her stomach, and she felt like she couldn't swallow or even think. Her own nervous tics took over as she picked up a pen to click and slid open her desk drawer for some gum. That's all you really need to know. She didn't believe him. Sir, what's going on? What do I need to know that I don't know? But he shook his head and stood. Nothing. Just, if you need anything, you'll let me know. Of course, sir. Thank you. He replaced his glasses and moved to leave. She hastily rose as well. Keep up the good work, Dr. Thompson. She nodded with a weak smile, still chewing on the gum, the cinnamon taste grounding her. He turned to leave, but quickly turned back. He knew the grounding techniques. She'd taught them to him when she helped Nate with his PTSD. She was hurting, and he could see it. She knew he could. A part of her wondered if President Wagner really would go see Joseph and tell him she was crying alone at her desk in the middle of a workday. But he was the president, and she didn't expect him to mix work with personal in the middle of the day, or ever, truthfully. This was the White House, not a college dormitory. She turned to return to her work, examining a file on her desk when she caught a glimpse of his hand waving to get her attention. The president smiled and made the sign for together, something she'd taught him recently with the impeachment hearings looming. She signed it back. They were all in this together, no matter what happened. It made her feel better about things, even if the worry returned as soon as she was left all alone in her office. Unaware of the president's conversation with Spencer, Joseph continued working in his office, a stoic monument within the West Wing, poised, composed, and ready to face anything the houses of government threw at them. The immediate worry that he would have to fire Spencer in light of the articles of impeachment had quickly proven non-existent. However, the damage from his secretive meetings still lingered. He hadn't spoken properly with Penny since the revelation and subsequent leak, and he knew people were starting to notice the contention between them. It had started seeping into their day-to-day working relationship, which, up to this point, had been easily amicable. He hated feeling like this, seeing her in the hallways and unable to say anything to her. It wasn't that he couldn't, he simply couldn't find the right words. Everything felt so wrong, and she wouldn't listen to him anyway. Betrayal cut deep, and he'd shown a ruthless quality she didn't like. Joseph leaned back in his chair, pinching the bridge of his nose to ward off a headache. He'd been getting those a lot more since everything imploded around him. He hated the feeling. Do you love her? Ken's voice cut through the silence, scaring him. It took him a moment to register the question over his heart pounding in his ears. He looked down, fingers falling from his nose, gaze settling on the president as he leaned in the doorway between the Oval and Joseph's office. That's a personal question. Bah. The president waved him off like he didn't want to hear some ridiculous excuse, which he didn't. You told me the minute you fell in love with Matilda. I never heard the end of it. Joseph balked, deciding to give up on work. It wasn't going to happen. I didn't do that. Oh, you did, and I know you did. I remember now. Do you love Spencer or not? If I answer your question, will you leave my office so I can get some work done? Yes. No. Ken paused for a long moment, staring at his friend with contempt and disbelief. "You should tell her. If you don't, I will." "Get in line behind Nate," Joseph said dryly, peering over his glasses. Ken straightened, his stare hard as he tried to convey his disappointment in his friend. "Desperate self-preservation doesn't suit you, Joseph." "What am I supposed to do, Mr. President?" Joseph snapped. "Tell her the truth." "And if I tell her the truth, what then? What do you think will happen? She'll come back like I didn't break her heart and betray everything she thinks I am?" His voice was sharp and cutting, entire body rigid, shoulders tight with anger he was trying to hold back. "You said she saw you in the meeting." "She was there, but she doesn't know what happened. I haven't been able to tell her." Ken stepped further into Joseph's office. His hands were shoved in his pockets. He was trying not to react to Joseph's anger. Ken learned very early on that reacting to Joseph when he felt cornered would just make him angrier. Joseph had even told him as much after one particularly heated argument once he calmed down. But this was something Joseph needed to face, and no one could push him to. And no one can push him to, not like Ken could. "There's something more to this you're not telling me." Ken sat in front of Joseph's desk, his gaze leveled on his friend. "I don't have to tell you anything, just as I don't have to tell her what happened to me before I met her. You told the team about it. What's the difference between them and her?" When Joseph didn't answer, Ken tried again, pushing buttons even though he knew better. He had to know. "Is she just a replacement for your addiction? Is that it?" Joseph erupted in a blaze of red-hot anger. "You don't know the first thing about our relationship," he said, dangerously, teeth clenched as he tried to reel in his emotions. It wasn't working. No, you're right, but I know what I've seen. You're moody, unpredictable. You've been working more, staying late and arriving early. You stopped doing that, but ever since the last crash, you've reverted. You're going through withdrawal. Like hell I am. You are. You don't even realize it." He didn't dispute the statement, but Penny was more than that. Or maybe she just hoped he was more than that. Maybe he wanted her to be more than that, but was too scared to take the first step. But hadn't he already taken that first step by going to her room while they were in Chicago? Hadn't he tried? Hadn't he tried to do everything right? "She's not a drug, Ken," he roared. But the bite behind the words was waning, beneath the emotions welling to the surface. "Then what the hell is she?" She's so much more than that. So despite that, you're going to lead her like a lamb to the slaughter. Save me your thinly veiled biblical metaphors. I'm aware of what I'm doing." "Then why are you doing it?" Ken asked, the question hitting Joseph hard, the anger retreating before the shame, sadness, and resignation. "Because I don't know how to tell her. Is that a good enough answer?" "I don't know how to tell her." "I feel like we've already established this." Joseph pinched the bridge of his nose again. He might as well just admit it. "I don't know how to tell her I love her. There, that's what I'm hiding. Yes, I love her. I think I've loved her since the second she walked through the door. I don't know how to tell her that. When she walks into a room, I can't breathe. Or that when I'm with her, I feel like I can be a better man. But every single time I try to live up to the expectations I put on myself, I fail. I'm failing her right now and bringing her down with me in the process. I did that to Matilda, but I refuse to do that to her." "Then you need to apologize. Whatever she's upset about, you did it. You fix it." Joseph shook his head. "It's easy for you to say. It's easy for you to do. Do to others what you would have them do to you. For this sums up the law and the prophets." Joseph continued quietly. He took a breath. If this goes bad, I'm blaming you. You always do, Ken teased fondly. Go, talk to her. She's in her office. Joseph didn't want to ask how he knew where she was, but didn't question it either. Ken was the President of the United States. Sweeping from his chair, he headed down the hall, straightening out his suit as he walked, nerves settling in the pit of his stomach as he got closer and closer to the office. He peeked down the hall and noticed Ronnie was out, no doubt talking to the lawyers in an attempt to seal up depositions. He knew Penny's day had arrived, and it scared him to death. Despite these emotions and the overwhelming urge to run away, Joseph stepped into Spencer's office and made his way closer to her desk. He was trying to gather the courage to wave and get her attention when her dark eyes met his. He swallowed thickly. "Have a seat." He did, his blue eyes still affixed to hers as he did. "Was there something you needed to say?" There were so many things he wanted to say. "I love you. I need you. I want you. You are so beautiful, even when I know you're sad. I never want to leave you or make you angry again." But for some reason, those words never came. Instead, all he could think to say was, "Good luck tomorrow at your deposition." Her shoulders slumped and her eyes told him all he needed to know as she replied with a flat, "Thanks." Well, this wasn't going well. He cleared his throat. What are you working on?" "Something Nate gave me." "Can I see?" She tried not to smile, biting her lower lip, and butterflies fluttered in Joseph's stomach. "I don't know, can you?" He also tried not to smile or laugh. "Don't start that again." "You know you like it." "When you tease me mercilessly? Yes, I do." She ducked her head a little, gaze still on him, a coy little grin tugging at her lips, and he knew she was blushing. "Joseph," she hissed quietly, "we are at work. We're at work." He chuckled. "I know, I'm sorry." But then the mirth and smile faded from his face, expression serious. "I'm sorry for what I did to you, and how I told the staff about us. I should never have done that." "No, you shouldn't have," she stated shortly. Joseph fell quiet again, at a loss for words. He heard the soft hum of the computer, the ticking of her watch, the exhalations of her breath. Everything felt so loud. He still wanted to run. He still wanted to avoid her anger and contempt and heartbreaking disappointment. "I suppose it would be too much to ask for your forgiveness. Too late to warn you that this is who I am. These are my true colors. That I am a wartime consigliere, and I never learned how to turn that off." Another stretch of quiet as he watched her consider those words. It set his teeth on edge. Waiting, wondering what she would say, how this all would end. "I knew who you were from the beginning." Her words landed harshly in the relative silence of the room. He swallowed, unsure of where this was going and if he wanted to know. "Cunning," she signed with a small smirk, and he didn't know if that was a smirk of adoration or contempt. "You were cunning." He took a breath. "I feel like there's an and in there somewhere. Please tell me there's an and." She snorted and shook her head, and he didn't know whether to be relieved or worried or somewhere in between. She was going to drive him crazy. He just knew it. She already was. "You worry too much." Joseph sat there for a moment, trying to figure out what that meant before he asked, "Is that a bad thing in this situation?" Penny laughed, truly, properly laughed, and the weight in his stomach eased tremendously. "Yeah, it is." She shook her head again, smiling warmly, reassuringly. "I wish I could have been there when you told them, but I'm glad we don't have to hide it anymore." He let out a shaky, relieved breath, like he was expelling all the anxious energy from inside of him. And maybe he was. "So, I'm forgiven?" she finished for him. He nodded. "Yeah, you're forgiven." Tears sprung unbidden to his eyes as she reached a hand out to him. He took it, twining their fingers, and squeezed. He might not have had the gumption to say it yet, but he loved her so very much, and he hoped she could sense it. If she couldn't, he only hoped he could muster the courage to say those words and say them soon. He never wanted to feel the stinging pain of loneliness he had while away from her, ever again. Thank you for listening to 2 parts of What We Cannot Hear, Heavy as the Head, and Silence Like Cancer Grows, pieces of a novel by S.A. Mackenzie. S.A. Mackenzie likes her stories like she likes her character actors. Warm, fuzzy, a bit worn in, and with a bit of emotion. She began writing at the age of 13 and focused on fan fiction. Now, she divides her time between short stories, film, and television-based articles, and her upcoming novel. Her short story Snapshots is currently available to buy on Amazon. Thank you so much to S.A. Mackenzie for allowing us to feature her work today. And there's still more to be had. We aren't finished with What We Cannot Hear just yet. All sounds you've heard this week come from YouTube's free music library or freesound.org. Everything is being used under a CC 01.0 public domain dedication license. And that does it for Prose this week. 2 amazing pieces to an amazing tale. We will, in the very near future, complete our journey with What We Cannot Hear. Until then, I do hope that you will all love those around you, tell them that you do, and embrace this life as it is, always, stranger than fiction. Thank you so much for listening.